Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Donspektor, and today I'll be looking at the one, at the only, the legendary, at the Blon BL03. And yeah, if the hype is to be believed, this is approximately the only IEM you will ever need. And according to what many people write, it's also the best cheap IEM you can find on the market. And if that actually holds up, and how much I think the hype is actually justified, and maybe how it stacks up to the KZ DQ6 I highly recommended in my last review, yeah, let's find out. And as usual, I'll be starting my review with packaging and accessories. Generally, the Blon BL03 comes in a pretty, I would say, good packaging for about €30 price. The cardboard is like white matte, and it comes in this, like, for my case, I'm not sure how the other Blons look like, but I have the purple version, so yeah, the coloring of the letters here is also this like dark bluish and shiny color. And the cardboard is not too thin, it's actually more on the thick side. And if you see the top of the case, yeah, the IEM is separately packed from the accessories. And yeah, removing the IEM at the top, yeah, man, reveals pretty like nice looking IEMs. And yeah, but we're talking about package and accessories, right? So yeah, the plastic thing here is pretty decent. And beneath that you find the accessory case, and that is also alright. Inside the accessories you find, I think 6 pair of tips, or maybe 8, I'm not entirely sure. At least 4 of them are more of these like round shaped, and the other one are more like cone shaped. So yeah, you do have a pretty, I would say, alright selection of tips. I would even say it's good if you consider the price of the IEM. Also in the packaging included, of course, the cable, which we talk about in the next section after the next section. And also a small carrying pouch, which is just from pretty bug standard fabric, and it has these 2 strings at the top, so you can actually close it. It's alright, yeah, for the price I would say even. Yeah, the amount of accessories you get and the packaging here is pretty good. Yeah, that's so far it. Then this next chapter, before we talk about the cable, which will probably be on many people's minds, let's talk about the IEM build. And yes, if you take the Blon here, it's completely made out of metal. And that I would say even pretty well. Meaning the chassis only consists of 2 parts, the top part of the shell and the bottom part of the shell. So this means the nozzle also is part of the bottom part of the shell, and if you just hold it in your hand, it's, I would say, weighty enough without being heavy, and it feels really good to the hand, which is most likely to it's like oval, round shaped, which is not really like ear shaped when we talk about comfort later on, but overall it does look and feel pretty nice. And yeah, because it's just 2 metal parts kind of mounted together, it also does feel like it's going to outlast quite some time. Unfortunately, the 2 parts of the shell are just put together relatively rough, and the seam between the 2 parts is pretty big. Even compared to other cheap IEMs, yeah, the seam here is huge in comparison. And I think over time it will probably have some dirt built up, but in the weeks I've been using the Blon BL03, at least my example didn't have any dirt built up in the seam here. Going from the seam to the nozzle, yeah, that is unfortunately relatively short, but the grill inside seems to be well put in place, and I didn't see any noticeable changes in the weeks I've used it, and I doubt that you're going to lose the grill over time, at least from just seeing the IEM build here. Also, nice touch, on both sides of the IEM, on the inside of the shell, you do have some printing which has Blon BL03, but also L and R, which is something the DQ6 unfortunately did miss. Also on the inside of the shell, there's just 1 tiny pressure hole, and this unfortunately can create some driver flags if you're using some foam tips which partly or completely block the pressure hole on the inside. I think it would have been a better choice to move the hole more to the side of the shell or even at the back side, so you do not go into danger to actually blocking the pressure hole and then creating driver flags. Going to the connectors, they're using 2-pin here, but not a regular 2-pin. No, it's this, I think they call it NX7 style 2-pin, meaning there's this like square bracket around it. And in theory, I think you could put in any like flush 2-pin cable. But yeah, if you want to have the best protection in quotes, you will need to find an NX7 style, which at least from what I've searched, is not that common to find. So overall, I would say, yeah, it does seem pretty durable from the build quality here. Especially again, considering the price of like 30 euro. It's not the best, especially if you compare it again to the DQ6, which overall for me is the better made IEM because it has smaller seams and also pressure holes are like more usable for me. But yeah, overall, no points to complain here for 30 euros. Then, as next chapter, let's talk about the infamous Blon cables. And yeah, as I already said in my DQ6 review, the point which makes you notice the price of the IEM the most, and I mean in a negative way, is the cable. The Blon cable especially, and it's not unusable, right? You can totally get away with the Blon cables, but it's pretty janky. It somehow always keeps like balling itself together and it never goes really straight. Combining that with the pretty like thin build quality this has, yeah, I doubt it's going to survive like even half a year normal day usage. The strain releases are similarly useless compared to the DQ6. I would say maybe a tiny bit better because the rubberization used here is a bit more soft, but really just a tiny bit. But positively I have to note here that the plastic thing behind the 3.5mm plug is definitely smaller and I would say even the better usable version compared to the DQ6. Then going up the cable to the splitter, yeah, that also is smaller in footprint, which is pretty nice. But again, it has the strain releases which do not really release any strain just because they are too small and a bit too stiff. Going even further up from here, you obviously come to the ear hooks. And yeah, I think most people already said it enough. The strong rubberization here combined with the more than like 180 degrees, it's I think like 230, 250 degrees in like the way it bends around your ear. The angle is just not natural and it's kind of difficult when we talk about comfort later on to get it a nice fit over your ear. But yeah, overall, I would not say the cable is terrible, but it's definitely not good. And overall, I would say it's probably on the same level as the DQ6, even for I think the cable of the DQ6 was a bit less janky in its overall handling. So then, and this is I think the biggest chapter or the biggest complaint for me with the Blon BL03, and that is comfort. And yeah, in my written review I said it's a tricky part, because I know this is a popular IEM, I know many people do like it, and there are not too many complaints with the comfort, but I really have to mention it. I had huge fitting issues with the Blon 03. This is most likely due to the shape of the IEM, which is not really like ear shaped, meaning the like oval casing is just too wide to fit well in my ear canal, and this overall results in the Blon having really shallow fit, which then also means I need to find deeper tips or tips which just fit my ear canal perfectly, and that is kind of tricky for my ear canal. And in practice that means I have this one longer pair of thin foam tips. I can only fit the Blon in my ear with this pair or with the, I think it's SM or what is it, the M section of the Elastic tips. And all other tips I used, and I had at least have like 10 pair of tips I regularly use, none of them did fit anywhere in my ear. They instantly fell out. So yeah, I really have to mention, I think the overall fit of the Blon BL03 is not good. It's just not really ear-shaped. And combining that with the cable, which I said before, is bending so hard behind your ear, yeah, I also get this like pressure spot on the top of my ear a bit, which does not annoy me in like, yeah, I would say 40 minutes, but after an hour or so, the overall like fitting issues combined with the cable, it just gets annoying and I do not want to use the Blons. So in direct comparison here to the DQ6, I would definitely prefer the DQ6 when we talk about comfort. Even for that also has fitting issues just finding the right pair of tips because of its thick lip on the nozzle. The next chapter would be isolation, and I can kind of keep this short. The Blon BL03, it isolates okay. It's pretty much average. Maybe if your ear works right for it and you do have a good foam tip, it will be a bit above average, but I don't think it's overall usable for just like city center trips when it's busy and there are trams and trains and cars around you and people speaking, and it's just not going to be good enough for that. But for office usage, if you just ride in a tram or in a train, I think it's totally fine and you will absolutely not have any problems with that. So then, before we come sound, let's still talk drivability. And after I said the DQ6, where they're pretty much drivable from almost everything, I have the feeling the Blon BL03 is not that good in terms of drivability. Meaning, if I just put it on my smartphone, which is a Galaxy S9 Plus, so not the newest anymore, it just sounds a bit like mushy. It does not sound wider, or not as wide as it could be. It just sounds a bit off to me. This instantly goes away if I plug it into my SP200. I mean, of course, that is a whole lot more power. But with this, actually, I do get the best results, at least when we talk about the sound signature that Blon has. It gets the widest, I think, at least what my ear perceive. It also gets the most detail it can be. And adding a bit additional treble brightness, for example, from the BTR5, also does make the perceived detail better. But I think the additional power the SP200 has, yeah, it does scale, at least to my ear, a bit. It's not much, right? So I did note down on my smartphone, I get like 80% of what the Blon is capable, which means on the SP200 you get like approximately 100, probably if you put in even cleaner amplifier you do get maybe a bit more, and the BTR5 it increases the perceived details I think a bit, but it's really just a bit, so that would also be close to the 100% the SP200 can provide. Adding tubes, or like hybrid tubes, I didn't really try because of the general signature, which we talk about in the next section now. Then, let's go to the core part of this review, and this is, of course, sound. And I'll be kicking things off with the general sound characteristics, followed by treble, mids, and at last the bass points. And in this video, I'm going to compare the Blon BL03 mostly to the DQ6, because that is kind of like price performance wise even a bit better than the Blons, but that's when we talk about verdict later on. And it also has like an V-shape-ish sound, so it makes sense to compare them here. Okay, so general characteristics. How would I describe the Blons? Well, it's definitely good V-shaped, and that I think even on the warmer side of things. Meaning the lower frequencies definitely take a like more pronounced role in the mix than the upper frequencies. Which is not a bad thing, right? We just talk about general characteristics, and I definitely say that this thing is a warm V-shaped. In direct comparison to the DQ6, it's on the exact opposite of the spectrum, because the DQ6, while also being V-shaped, is definitely more on the brighter side of V-shaped, meaning here, the upper frequencies are pronounced more than the lower frequencies. And yes, that also brings me to treble region, because that's where the DQ6 I think was a pretty strong contender. Especially considering its price point. It was so well balanced in the treble with just some really minor problems, and the Blon unfortunately cannot hold up with that. Which means, yeah, it's still V-shaped and the treble is pronounced, but the way it is pronounced I think is just not as smooth as in the DQ6, and because the overall tuning here hasn't been done as well, also not as resolving. This means the Blon does have a few peaks in the treble, and here I think it's just not good enough, meaning the 8K peak is a bit too harsh, and it overall, it outshines the, I think it's like the 6K peak or like something in that region. It just outshines that, which results in some symbols and mostly S and F being much too sharp in some mixes. It's not as bad as the Bayer peak, right? So if you come for Bayer dynamic, well, yeah, the peak there is totally out of question. It's much stronger. But the DQ6 has the overall better balance here, which just makes it overall, I think, the better treble IEM, or like the IEM of the better treble. Side note, with an EQ of, I think, like 2 to 3 decibels on the 8K peak, you will probably get a pretty nice treble representation. But overall, I still think the perceived detail of the KZ DQ6 will still be better, because it's overall in more bright representation and it's generally like tuned better, so you don't even have to put any EQ to it. It will just sound right in the treble region most of the times. I still want to give one example which I did find noticeable here, and this was Zero from Sidewalks and Skeletons from the album Entity. And I usually pick this thing because it has sharp S and F, and it has this like reverberating effect for the vocals. And while this can be matched with some IEMs, I think the Blon really was a bit too much. It just was too harsh, and I didn't really enjoy it. It was still fine, right? But I didn't enjoy it in the way it would have been with other IEMs, even compared to the DQ6. Going from here to the mids, yeah, it's V-shaped. So the mids generally take a bit of the backseat role here, which isn't true for all parts of the mids, which means the upper mids, where female vocals usually reside, or mostly reside, is pretty well balanced. I didn't find it to be particularly shouty or anything, it was totally fine, and in general it was relatively clear to understand. And yeah, again here I did notice in Zero's sidewalks and skeletons at 0.33 minutes, or like 34 seconds, sorry, they have a vocal start. The general tonality is totally fine, you can understand them pretty nice in the overall mix, but then the S and F hit you and they're just a tad too sharp. The DQ6 did not have this problem. It maybe could have been a bit too sharp, but because of the overall balance, I didn't feel like it was too much for me. Just maybe a tad in some other songs, but as I said in this review, like 95% of everything I threw at it, DQ6 was fine, while the Blonde was not. And when we go from here to the mids, yeah, also I think, again, because the DQ6 is like less V-shaped, it does a bit better for the mid section in general. This means like the mids on the Blonde are still pretty well understandable, and I didn't have too much of problems when I threw, for example, Broadwivers from Iron Maiden at them, but the DQ6 I thought were just a bit better pronounced in the mids here. Another example would be Catharsis from Nightcrawler, which also has some pretty decent vocals, and also here I thought, yeah, the DQ6 did just a bit better than the Blondes. And then as last part of the mids, the lower mids, yeah, some people will probably say the Blon BL03 has some bass bleed, which makes lower mids pretty nicely pronounced, but I didn't mind it in most cases, which I know I talk about when we talk about bass. So yes, as in one V-shaped IEM, yeah, this is where the fun begins, in the bass section. This means, as I said before, lower mids are pretty well pronounced, and also upper bass is really well pronounced. This results in bass guitars having really nice weight to the strings, and I think in most of the songs that's totally fine, and like 85% of the times I listened something to the Blondes, I didn't have any problem with the overly pronounced bass guitars, but when there are still the 15%, and this means something which already has a pretty weighty bass guitar, for example Accident Love by Katsutoshi Morisono, this is kind of fusion jazz, it already has a really strongly pronounced bass guitar, and with the Blondes it just was too much. It did outshine the rest of the mix by not as much as I would like. Again, by contrast, the DQ6 just did a better job here. It also had slightly pronounced bass guitars, but not too much. Then going from here to the mid bass, and yeah, the mid bass, yes, this is pronounced really well. I think this is where most people come to like the Blondes best, because it walks on the small border between it becomes mushy and it's too much and it's still just right. For me, or for my personal preference here, I think it's a bit too much, and I would probably EQ it down by like 2 to 3 decibels at least to still have some fun without being too dry. But I think it does deliver a pretty good bassline. And let me just mention here a Depressive Ghost from Nightcrawler. It was a tiny bit too much to my ear, just because I'm not such a huge bass fan. But oh yes, the overall balance and the punch it had definitely was pretty nice. Here, the DQ6 you could say did lag a bit, but for me overall I do like the more, I don't want to say drier bass representation, but the less mushy one. Another example I did look was Odd Look by Kavinsky. In general, again, it was too much in the bass region because it has a pretty strong bass line, but it's still fun to listen to, and I think most people absolutely have no problem with the mid bass here. It's fun, right? And then going from here to the sub bass, yeah, it's still good. It's not the best you can probably get at this price point, but then you would probably go to directly like bass focused IEMs, which just isn't in fact. So yeah, it does have a pretty good extension in Stella's Mountains, when deep bass note starts at 2.10 minutes and would go all the way down to 2.16. And the Blonde does manage it until like a bit after 2.14. So it does beat the DQ6 in extension, but this could also be just perceived because the Blondes definitely do have overall more bass energy, which does mean, yeah, of course you're going to hear the low bass notes longer if it does not drop into the abyss like other IEMs do. So yes, and then let's go to the next section, and this would be dynamics, soundstage, layering and imaging. I try to keep these two shorter together in IEM reviews that are like more cheapish. And yeah, I would say this is also the section where the Blon, it just beats the DQ6 easily. Not in dynamics though, the dynamics are pretty similar, I would say. So yeah, you can tell the difference between a loud and a really quiet note, but it becomes difficult to tell the differences in volume between like louder notes and quieter notes. But that's also not the point here. It's pretty cheap IEM, so that's nothing it should be able to do. So yeah, then as I said, where the Blon beats the KZ DQ6 easily is Soundstage and imaging. This means where the DQ6, as I said, was definitely below average in Soundstage and also not that nice in imaging, yeah, the Blon is. Even on my smartphone, it did have a quite a bit bigger Soundstage. I would even say it's definitely above average in Soundstage, and also the imaging was better. It does not manage its best on my smartphone in terms of imaging and soundstaging, but it's still pretty well, and only gets beaten by IEMs which are more expensive like the T2 Another point which I still have to mention here, but it's not really like a point of critique for an IEM of this price, layering was not that good. Meaning you usually have this like free blob phenomenon, meaning you get like center in between your ears and then left and right, and perceived depth. Sometimes if a song is mixed well, you still get this like outside layer, but most of the time you just don't. It's just free blobs and that's it. And this directly brings me to a verdict. Would I recommend the Blon BL03? Yes, absolutely, without any question. The Blon BL03 is a pretty good IEM, especially considering the price point. It does look and feel well built, and it sounds pretty much right in most of the genres you throw at it. In rock, in metal, in synthwave, even in orchestral soundtracks or jazz. It always sounds like, yes, it will work here. But, and this is a big but, does it sound better than the DQ6? And here, unfortunately, I have to say, no, it doesn't. Yes, granted, the DQ6 is on the other side of the V spectrum, meaning it's more bright, while the Blon is more warm. But overall, I don't think the better imaging in Soundstage does justify the additional investment in price, which is, I think, for, as I said, 17 euro for the DQ6, by 30 euro, or a bit more for the Blons. And also you do get the, I think, like bit worse built IEM because of the big seams. And also have to mention it, my pair of Blons did die during my review. The left side just refuses to work, and I did try to change cables, it doesn't do anything, my left side just died while I was using it. While my pair of DQ6, yeah, I threw it in my bag a few times after the review, I used it on the go, and it's still working totally fine. So yeah, unfortunately I have to say, no, I would not recommend the Blon over the DQ6, which is mostly also due to the better treble representation the DQ6 has. And yeah, it's also the cheaper IEM. So yes, if you are more into bass, you can totally get the Blons. But if you are more into, like, I would say, balanced or like better working all-around sound signature, I would probably recommend the KZ DQ6 instead of the Blons. Yeah, and with this, I hope you enjoyed this review and you found something informative. Donspektor out!